The night it happened, the air was so cold it felt like knives against my skin. I stood on the porch with my suitcase at my feet, watching Gerald's back as he turned away. Lydia stood behind him with her arms crossed, her face hard and cold. She didn't even look at me when she said, "You know what you did, Evan. Don't come back." I didn't argue. I just stood there, trying to breathe, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart in one night. My hands were shaking. I wanted to tell them I hadn't taken the money, that I would never steal from them. But the words felt useless. They'd already decided what they wanted to believe. Gerald slammed the door shut, and the sound of it echoed down the empty street. I stared at the porch light for a while, hoping maybe the door would open again, that this was some terrible mistake. It didn't. I lifted my suitcase and started walking. The snow was coming down heavier now, sticking to my hair and jacket. Every step crunched against the frozen ground. I didn't know where to go. I didn't have friends close enough to call. Most people at school didn't even know I lived with foster parents. I'd never told them much about my life. By midnight, I found myself behind a closed diner on the edge of town. The place was dark, except for a faint light in the kitchen window. I sat down against the wall, pulled my jacket tight, and tried not to think. My fingers were numb, and my breath came out in clouds. I tried to tell myself this was temporary, that the Cranes would realize their mistake in the morning. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't. I thought about everything I had done to make them proud. Working after school at the gas station, mowing lawns on weekends, giving them my paychecks so we could keep the lights on. Gerald always said I should be grateful, that they didn't have to take me in. I believed him. I thought maybe if I worked hard enough, they'd start to see me as part of the family. But standing there in the snow, I realized I'd only ever been a burden to them. The cold crept deeper into my bones. I pulled my knees up to my chest, trying to stay warm. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. I had $22 in my pocket, barely enough for food. I thought about knocking on the diner's back door, maybe asking for help, but the idea of explaining why I was out there stopped me. That night felt endless. Every sound, cars on the road, the wind whistling through the cracks, made me feel smaller. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lydia's face, heard her voice accusing me. The woman who once called me son had looked at me like I was nothing. By morning, the snow had covered my suitcase. I brushed it off and sat in silence, watching the sunrise turn the town pale orange. My heart felt heavy, empty all at once. I didn't know it then, but that moment, sitting behind that diner, alone and broken, was the end of one life and the start of another. I used to think the Cranes had saved me. When I first moved into their house at 11, everything felt warm and safe. Lydia made pancakes that first morning, and Gerald patted my shoulder, telling me, "You're part of the family now, son." I believed him. After years of bouncing between foster homes, it finally felt like I belonged somewhere. For a long time, I tried to hold on to that feeling. As I got older, small things started to change. Gerald would come home from work and remind me, "We saved you, boy. Remember that?" At first, it sounded like a joke, but he said it often enough that it began to sting. Lydia would nod and add, "You should be thankful, Evan. Not everyone would take in a child like you." I didn't know what she meant by a child like you, but the way she said it made me feel like I should apologize for even existing. I worked hard to make them proud. I cleaned the house, helped with chores, and took part-time jobs once I turned 16. Every paycheck I brought home, Lydia took it, saying it would go toward house expenses. I never questioned her. I thought that was what family did, helped each other. But the older I got, the more I started noticing how the math didn't add up. They had new furniture, new clothes, but I wore the same worn-out jacket year after year. When I got accepted into the trade school in town, I was excited. It felt like a way forward, something that could finally change my life. I showed them the acceptance letter at dinner. Lydia read it quickly and set it down without saying a word. Gerald just grunted and kept eating. After a while, Lydia said, "That's good, Evan. But you'll have to find a way to pay for it. We're not covering that." I reminded her they were still getting the foster checks meant for my care, but she snapped before I could finish. "You think that money's for you? You live here, eat here, use our water and heat. That money barely covers what you cost us." Her words cut deep. I sat there staring at my plate, pretending her words didn't hurt, but my chest burned with shame. A week later, I found a letter from the county foster office in the mail. It mentioned funds being approved for my school costs. Lydia must have seen it too because by the next morning, it was gone. When I asked about it, she said I must have imagined it. That's when I realized what was happening. The Cranes weren't struggling. They were using the money for themselves. From that day, the house didn't feel like home anymore. Every time Gerald said, "We saved you," I heard something darker behind it, a reminder that I owed them, that I'd never be free of that debt. I kept quiet, though. I told myself I could wait it out until I turned 18, that I'd leave on my own terms. But the night they accused me of stealing was the night I understood what kind of people they really were. The betrayal wasn't sudden, it had been building for years. I just hadn't wanted to see it. By the time they kicked me out, I realized the truth. I'd never been their son. I'd been a paycheck. 3 days after I was kicked out, I sat in the corner of the public library, trying to stay warm. My suitcase was under the table, and I pretended to read a newspaper so no one would ask me to leave. My stomach hurt from hunger, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I had nowhere to go, no plan, nothing. That's when a man stopped in front of my table. He was dressed in a dark grey coat, clean and expensive looking, like someone who belonged in an office, not in a small-town library. He looked at me carefully and said, "Are you Evan Mercer?" I froze. Hardly anyone used my last name. For a moment, I thought maybe he was with social services or the police. I nodded slowly, unsure what to say. The man smiled slightly, then pulled out a small card and slid it across the table. "My name is Walter Grady. I'm an attorney. I've been trying to locate you for some time." My heart started to race. "Why?" I asked. He sat down across from me, his voice calm and polite. "I represent the estate of your grandfather, Samuel Mercer. He passed away a few weeks ago." I almost laughed. "You've got the wrong person," I said. "I don't have a grandfather." Walter opened a leather folder and took out a photograph. It showed an older man with grey hair and kind eyes, standing beside a woman holding a little boy, Mir. My throat tightened. I didn't remember the picture being taken, but I knew my mother's face instantly. "That's her," I whispered. "That's my mom." Walter nodded. "Grace Mercer. She was your mother. She passed away when you were 7. I looked down at the picture again, my hands shaking. "I was told there wasn't any family," I said quietly. "That's not true," Walter replied. "Your grandfather tried to get custody after your mother's death, but there was a legal dispute. Somehow, the court placed you in foster care instead. He searched for you for years, but the trail went cold." I felt dizzy. Everything he was saying sounded unreal. What does any of this have to do with me? Walter looked me straight in the eyes. "Before your grandfather died, he wrote a will. He left his entire estate, approximately $50 million, to his only grandchild, you. But before anything can be finalized, we have to prove your identity through records and DNA testing." I just stared at him, my mouth dry. $50 million. The words didn't make sense. I thought it had to be a scam. I told him I didn't believe him, that I didn't have anything worth stealing. Walter didn't argue. He reached into his briefcase again and handed me a sealed envelope. "Your mother wrote this before she passed. She wanted you to have it when you were old enough." My hands shook as I opened it. The handwriting was hers. The first line read, "Evan, my sweet boy, if you're reading this, it means life took a path I never wanted for you." I couldn't keep reading. My eyes blurred with tears. Walter waited silently, giving me time. When I finally looked up, he said softly, "You have family, Evan. You always did. You were just kept from them." I sat there in shock, trying to breathe. In 3 days, I had gone from being homeless to being told I might be worth $50 million. But the money didn't even matter at that moment. What hit me hardest was something else, that maybe, for the first time in my life, someone had actually wanted me. Over the next few weeks, Walter and I met almost every day. He started digging into my records, asking for anything that could prove who I was, old school documents, foster care files, even photos. At first, I thought it was just normal legal work, but then his questions began to sound different. He asked about the Cranes, about how they treated me, and about the money they received while I lived with them. I didn't understand why it mattered until he showed me a file one afternoon that made my stomach drop. According to the papers, the Cranes had been receiving not only the usual foster care payments but also additional deposits from a private trust fund, money that had been set aside years ago for my welfare. It was my grandfather's money, meant to help me while I grew up. The total amount was more than enough to cover school, food, and clothes, everything I had gone without. But none of it ever reached me. They had used it all for themselves. Walter's voice was calm, but I could see the anger in his eyes. They knew, Evan. They knew exactly who you were. I sat there staring at the pages, trying to make sense of it. You mean they knew about my family? About the inheritance? He nodded slowly. The trust required that your legal guardians report to the court once a year. Somewhere along the way, someone forged those reports. The Cranes must have realized how much money was involved. They kept you in their care to keep the funds coming. When you got close to turning 18, they had no reason to keep you anymore. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I thought back to all the times Lydia had reminded me how expensive I was to raise, how they were doing me a favor. I remembered her voice on the phone late one night, whispering in the kitchen. At the time, I only caught a few words. As long as he's under our roof, the checks keep coming. I hadn't understood what she meant. Now it all made sense. I felt sick. All those years I had blamed myself for not being enough, not grateful enough, not obedient enough. But it had never been about me. They hadn't kept me out of kindness. They had kept me for profit. Walter placed a hand on the table. We can press charges. Fraud, embezzlement, maybe more. You deserve justice. I nodded, but justice didn't feel like enough. The anger inside me burned too deep for that. I wanted them to know what it felt like to lose everything, to have their lies exposed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every memory. Every time Gerald made me feel small. Every time Lydia called me ungrateful. The betrayal felt heavier than ever, but it also gave me strength. They had used me for years, and they thought they'd gotten away with it. Not this time. For the first time in my life, I had power on my side. Walter wanted justice, but I wanted something more personal. I didn't just want them punished. I wanted them to see me rise from the wreckage they created. I wanted them to watch as the boy they threw away became the man who took everything back. Walter helped me move into a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, one room, a small kitchen, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot, but it was warm, quiet, and mine. After sleeping behind a diner, it felt like a palace. The estate covered the rent while the legal process continued, but I made sure to find work right away. I didn't want to depend on anyone again. I got a part-time job at a hardware store a few blocks away. The pay wasn't great, but I didn't care. I showed up early, stayed late, and saved every dollar I could. For the first time, the money I earned went into my own pocket. I kept track of every cent, writing it all down in a notebook. It made me feel in control, like I was finally building something for myself. Walter checked in often. He wasn't just an attorney anymore. He had become the only real support I had. One day, he suggested I start therapy. I didn't like the idea at first. Talking about the past felt useless. But he said something that stuck with me. Healing isn't about forgetting, Evan. It's about taking your story back. So, I went. The therapist, a woman named Diane, listened without judgment. I told her about the Cranes, the lies, the way I'd been made to feel like I owed them my life. Sometimes I talked. Sometimes I just sat there, silent. She told me that the anger I felt wasn't weakness. It was the part of me that still believed I deserved better. Week by week, I started to believe her. Even as I began to heal, the thought of the Cranes never left me. Every time I walked home from work or sat alone in my apartment, I thought about them. I wondered if they still told people they were good foster parents. I wondered if they ever thought about me at all. I doubted it. People like them didn't lose sleep over what they did to others. But I wasn't the same boy they threw out. I was learning to stand on my own, to plan, to prepare. Walter kept me updated on the case, and it was only a matter of time before everything became official, before I inherited what was mine. When that day came, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't want to hurt them physically or scream at them in court. That would have been too easy. No, I wanted something else. I wanted them to see me succeed. I wanted them to see the life I built without their control or their money. I wanted them to realize that they hadn't broken me. They had only created the version of me that would one day rise above them. At night, I would stand by the window and look out at the streetlights, imagining that moment. The thought didn't make me bitter. It gave me strength. Every shift I worked, every session I went to, every dollar I saved brought me closer to it. I was no longer the boy who begged for love. I was a man learning how to live without needing anyone's permission. And when the time came, the Cranes would see that the person they tried to destroy had become someone they could never touch again. The day the court hearings began, The air inside the courthouse felt heavy. I sat beside Walter at the long wooden table, trying to keep my hands still. Across the room, Gerald and Lydia sat together, dressed neatly like they were posing for a family photo. Lydia kept her head low, but every few minutes, she looked over at me with that same sharp glare I'd seen 100 times before. Gerald's face was blank, cold, as if he still thought he had control. Walter had warned me the Cranes would play innocent. "They'll try to make this emotional," he said quietly before we started. "Don't respond. Just stay calm. The truth will speak louder than anything they say." And he was right. When Lydia took the stand, her tears came fast. She told the court how they loved Evan like a son and how they were devastated that he thought they'd ever hurt him. She said they used the money for his care, for food and clothes and school supplies. She talked like she'd been the perfect mother. Gerald backed her up, saying I was troubled and ungrateful. Hearing them twist the truth like that made my stomach turn, but I didn't say a word. Then Walter began his questioning. He was calm, polite, and precise. He laid out document after document, bank statements, payment logs, expense reports. He pointed to forged signatures that matched Lydia's handwriting. He showed how the money meant for my education had been spent on luxury furniture, vacations, and personal credit card bills. With each piece of evidence, the Cranes' story started to crumble. At one point, Walter handed the judge a report from the trust fund office showing Lydia's name signed in place of mine. Lydia's face turned pale. She tried to speak, but the judge raised his hand and told her to stay silent. I watched the judge's expression change from neutral to cold. It was the first time I'd seen someone look at them the way I always had, as liars. When Walter finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge spoke slowly, his voice echoing through the room. He said the evidence showed clear fraud and intentional misuse of funds. He ordered the Cranes to pay full restitution and announced that the state would review their case for possible criminal charges. Lydia's shoulders shook as the bailiff led them out of the room. Gerald didn't look at me once. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for them, but then I remembered the nights I'd gone hungry while they spent my money on themselves. That sympathy vanished. As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in years. The cold air outside hit my face, sharp and clean. I was free of them now, completely. Behind me, I heard Lydia's voice. She had slipped out of the crowd, her face red with anger. "You think money will make you happy?" she hissed. I looked at her for the last time and said quietly, "No. But it'll make me free." Then I turned away and walked down the courthouse steps, each step feeling steadier than the one before. The fight was over. They no longer owned any part of my life. When the final papers were signed and the inheritance was officially transferred, it didn't feel real. Walter handed me a folder with the documents, his expression proud but calm. "It's yours now, Evan," he said. Inside were details about the estate, properties, and investments that my grandfather had built over a lifetime. The number written on the summary page didn't even seem possible. $50 million. For a long time, I just stared at it, feeling numb. I thought I would feel excited, maybe even powerful, but mostly I felt quiet inside. The money didn't erase what had happened. It didn't change the years I'd lost or the people who had used me. But it did mean something else. I finally had control of my life. No one could take that from me anymore. Walter helped me understand how to manage everything. He brought in financial advisors and lawyers, but he always made sure I was the one making decisions. "This isn't just wealth," he told me. "It's responsibility." I listened to him, trusting him more than I had ever trusted any adult before. Over time, he became more than my attorney. He was steady, patient, and always looking out for me, the kind of man I had wished for growing up. Instead of buying cars or houses, I started small. I went back to school and finished my trade program. Then I began setting up small scholarships for foster kids who were aging out of the system. I knew how hard that road was, how it felt to be alone with nothing. Helping them gave me a purpose I didn't know I needed. With Walter's help, I also started looking at community projects, funding after-school programs, donating to shelters, and repairing old buildings in my town. Every time I signed a check, I thought about how the Cranes had used money to take from me, and how I was now using it to give back. It made the pain feel a little lighter. One quiet afternoon, I visited my grandfather's old house for the first time. It stood on a hill just outside the city, surrounded by tall trees and a wide field. The caretaker, an older woman, led me to his study. The air smelled faintly of wood and paper. On the desk was a box of letters he had written but never sent. I sat there for hours, reading through them one by one. Most were addressed to lawyers and child services, asking about me, begging for updates. The last few were written directly to me, though he never got the chance to deliver them. In one, he wrote, "I don't know where you are, Evan, but I hope you're safe. I hope you know you're loved." I didn't realize I was crying until one of the letters blurred in my hands. My grandfather had never stopped looking for me. Even when the system failed him, he didn't give up. When I left the house that evening, the sun was setting behind the trees, painting everything gold. For the first time in years, I felt both grief and peace. I couldn't change the past, but I finally knew the truth. I had been wanted all along. 2 years passed before I went back to my old town. Life had changed completely. I had finished school, started working with Walter on community projects, and learned how to live without the constant weight of my past. But no matter how far I moved forward, a small part of me still carried the memory of that porch, that night, and the faces of the people who threw me out. I knew that one day, I would have to face them, not for revenge, but to finally close the door for good. The town looked smaller when I drove through it again. The streets I used to walk felt different, emptier somehow. When I turned down the old road that led to the Crane's house, I almost didn't recognize it. The paint was peeling, the yard was overgrown, and one of the windows was covered with a piece of cardboard instead of glass. The place looked tired, just like the people who used to live there. I parked my car on the street and sat there for a moment, gathering myself. My hands didn't shake this time. I wasn't the scared boy they'd thrown away. I was someone else now, stronger, calm, and sure of who I was. After a deep breath, I walked up the cracked sidewalk and knocked on the door. It took a while, but finally, Lydia opened it. Her hair was grayer, her face harder. When she saw me, her mouth fell open. "Evan," she said softly, like she couldn't believe I was real. "Hello, Lydia," I said. My voice was steady. For a moment, she just stood there, searching my face, maybe trying to read what I wanted. Gerald wasn't anywhere in sight. "I didn't come here to argue," I said before she could speak. "I just wanted to say thank you." She frowned, confused. "Thank you." I nodded. "For teaching me what family shouldn't be." Her eyes flickered, but she didn't say anything. I reached into my coat and took out an envelope. "This is for you," I said, handing it to her. She looked at it like it might burn her fingers. "What is this?" she asked. "It's a check for $10,000, I said quietly. "It's not forgiveness. It's closure." She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't stay to hear it. I turned and walked back toward my car. The air felt heavy behind me, like the weight of everything that had ever happened in that house was still trying to pull me back. But it couldn't anymore. When I reached the car, I looked at the house one last time. The front door was still open, and Lydia stood there holding the envelope. For a moment, our eyes met, and then I got in and drove away. As I left that street behind, I felt a strange calm settle inside me. I hadn't gone there to punish them or make them feel small. I went to prove something to myself, that I didn't need anger anymore. I had built a life they could never take from me. Walking away wasn't weakness this time. It was freedom. Starting the Mercer Foundation was the first thing that truly felt right. It began as a small idea, a way to use my inheritance for something that actually mattered. I wanted to help kids like me, foster teens who had no one waiting for them when they turned 18. Walter helped me set up everything legally, and within a few months, the foundation had its first building, a simple apartment complex with 10 units, a shared kitchen, and a study room. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe. That's what mattered most. We started accepting applications from local foster programs. The first few residents moved in quietly, carrying everything they owned in a backpack or a single suitcase. I saw myself in each of them, the same lost look, the same fear of being alone. We helped them find jobs, taught them basic life skills, and covered their first year of rent. I visited often, not as someone rich or important, but as someone who understood. Soon after, I began adding scholarships. Not everyone wanted college. Some preferred trade schools, others wanted to learn business or art. We funded them all. The foundation grew faster than I expected. Donations began to come in from people who believed in what we were doing, and I made sure every dollar went back into helping someone find their place in the world. Every week, letters started arriving at the office. Some were from current residents, others from those who had already moved on. They wrote about how they'd gotten jobs, how they'd found homes of their own, how they no longer felt invisible. I kept every letter in a wooden box on my desk. On hard days, I opened it and reread them. Each one reminded me that the pain I'd lived through wasn't wasted. Walter came by often to check on things. One afternoon, we sat in the office watching a few of the residents paint the lobby walls. He looked at me with that calm, proud smile he always had. "You did it, Evan," he said. "You turned pain into something powerful. That's wealth no one can steal." His words stayed with me. The Cranes had stolen years of my life and the money meant to care for me, but they hadn't stolen my spirit. I had taken everything they tried to break and built something unshakable. A few months later, I drove out to the cemetery where my mother was buried. It was a quiet place with tall trees and soft wind. I brought a single white rose and knelt beside her grave. For a long time, I just sat there, thinking about everything that had happened. The lies, the anger, the loss, and the strange path that had led me here. I placed the rose down and whispered, "They took everything from me once. But now, I'm giving it back to the world." For the first time, the words didn't hurt. They felt like peace. The pain that once defined me had turned into something bigger, something that could keep helping others long after I was gone. As I stood and looked up at the sky, I felt it deep in my chest. This was what my life was meant to become. A few months after the foundation had fully started running on its own, I received an envelope in the mail. The return address said it was from a law firm in New York. I thought at first it might be more paperwork from the estate, something routine. But when I opened it, there was a short letter from one of my grandfather's old attorneys. He wrote that while sorting through old files, they had found an additional sealed note that Samuel Mercer had left for me. I sat at my desk for a long time, just looking at the envelope. It was yellowed with age, the handwriting elegant and steady. My name was written across the front, to my grandson, Evan. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. The message was short, but it stopped me in my tracks. "The true inheritance isn't the money, Evan. It's the courage to be more than what others made you believe." I read it again and again until the words settled deep in my chest. It wasn't about the estate, the fortune, or even the revenge I once thought I wanted. It was about becoming someone different, someone who had taken everything meant to destroy him and turned it into something good. My grandfather must have known that I would need those words someday. And he was right. I folded the note carefully and placed it inside the same box that held the letters from the foster kids. Somehow, it felt like it belonged there, among all the proof that life could still grow out of broken things. Later that week, I drove out to see a new project the foundation had finished, a foster home built for younger kids who had nowhere else to go. The building was bright and welcoming, with blue shutters and a playground in the back. I stood outside, watching as volunteers moved furniture inside and kids ran around the yard. A little boy, maybe 8 years old, came up to me holding a thin blanket. He looked shy, his eyes full of uncertainty, the same way mine had been years ago. I knelt down and handed him a new blanket from the box beside me. "You're safe here," I said gently. "I promise." He gave a small nod and ran back toward the house. I stood there for a while, listening to the sound of laughter drifting through the air. As I looked at the home, full of life, full of hope, I finally understood what my grandfather meant. The real inheritance wasn't the wealth or the property. It was the strength to rise above the pain, to become more than what others had tried to make me. The Cranes had taken my childhood, but they hadn't taken my future. I had turned betrayal into strength and revenge into purpose. And as I stood there, surrounded by the laughter of children who finally had a place to belong, I realized something simple and true. I hadn't just won in court. I had won in life.